The North Atlantic, winter 1953. Wind howls over a grey sea. Waves rise and crash against steel hull. On the flight deck of HMS Centaur, the carrier rolls and pitches like a living thing. A single Seahawk jet circles above, low on fuel, its pilot fighting the gusts, his helmet fogged by his own breath. But something is different this time. The ship isn't aligned straight into the wind. Its landing area now cuts diagonally across the deck, a strange, almost backwards strip of painted lines. Instead of aiming down the carrier's spine, the pilot approaches at an angle, his nose offset to the right, eyes locked on a new, glowing optical landing aid mounted by the deck edge. Engines scream, deck crew crouch behind barriers. The jet slams down, hook catches wire, arrested landing. In the same moment, another aircraft is being catapulted from the bow. Two operations once impossible to combine now unfold simultaneously. That single slanted runway would double a fleet's striking power and forever change how navies ruled the seas. In the final years of World War II, aircraft carriers had become the most valuable ships afloat and also the most dangerous. The straight-deck design, inherited from the earliest experimental carriers of the 1920s, demanded absolute precision from pilots. There was no room for error. When a Corsair or Hellcat came into land, it had to align perfectly with the ship's centerline. If the tail hook missed all the arrestor wires, the aircraft became what sailors called a bolter, a runaway jet still traveling at 100 knots. With nowhere to go except straight ahead into rows of parked aircraft, refueling hoses, and armed bombs. Every missed landing was a potential catastrophe. Flight decks were short, cluttered, and lined with crew and machinery. Recovery operations were dangerous, even in calm weather. During heavy seas, a carrier could roll several degrees each second, causing pilots to misjudge their sink rate by just a few feet. The result was often fatal, yet despite these risks, carriers won the Pacific War. Their ability to project air power over hundreds of miles had proven decisive at Midway, the Coral Sea and Leyte Gulf. But after 1945, victory created a new challenge. The jet age arrived. By the late 1940s, naval aviation faced an existential crisis. The piston-engine fighters of World War II were being replaced by sleek, powerful jet aircraft. They were faster, heavier, and most critically, slower to respond to throttle adjustments. Unlike propeller planes, early jets needed several seconds to spool up power. For a pilot about to miss the wires on a carrier deck, those seconds could mean life or death. When the first jets, like the de Havilland Sea Vampire and McDonnell F-H Phantom, began landing on carriers, the results were alarming. Landing speeds increased from 75 knots to over 120. The higher inertia and slower engine response meant more crashes, more damaged aircraft, and more lives lost. Carrier commanders knew something had to change. The biggest problem wasn't just safety, it was efficiency. Straight-deck carriers could either launch aircraft or recover them, but never both. While one group landed, the other had to wait in holding patterns, burning fuel. Each deck cycle, the process of launching, recovering, and repositioning aircraft, could take over an hour. In combat, that delay was devastating. A task force could only keep a small fraction of its air wing airborne at any given moment. Strike coordination became complex and inflexible. In a nuclear age defined by speed, such limitations made carriers look increasingly obsolete compared to land-based bombers and missiles. Some senior officers even questioned whether the era of the carrier was over. In 1949, as the Royal Navy wrestled with these same problems, a handful of British engineers began sketching radical alternatives. What if the landing path wasn't aligned with the ship's length at all? What if it was set at an angle? The idea was deceptively simple. Paint a slanted landing strip across the deck so that a missed approach, rather than ploughing into parked aircraft, would send the plane safely past the ship's port side, clear of obstructions. Pilots could immediately throttle up, fly around and try again, But to make such a concept work, everything else would need rethinking: arrestor wires, barriers, catapults, even deck markings. And not everyone believed it was possible. Still, the logic was undeniable. A carrier could now, in theory, recover aircraft while launching others from the bow. That would effectively double its operational tempo. By the early 1950s, both the Royal Navy and US Navy had reached the same conclusion. If carriers were to survive in the jet age, their decks themselves had to evolve. At the center of this revolution was a soft-spoken British test pilot named Captain Dennis Cambell, a man whose persistence would transform naval aviation. In 1951, Captain Dennis Cambell of the Royal Navy began experimenting with what looked like a reckless idea: land a jet not straight down the deck, but diagonally across it. Working with engineer Lewis Boddington at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Cambell had been searching for a solution to the jet landing crisis that plagued every navy. They drew a bold white stripe on a mock-up carrier deck, angled several degrees off the center line. It looked absurd, like someone had painted it wrong. Yet when test pilots simulated approaches, something remarkable happened. The offset view improved their sense of alignment, and any missed wire meant the aircraft would pass safely alongside the ship instead of into the parked planes. By late 1951, Cambell had convinced senior officers to let him try it at sea. The trials took place on HMS Triumph using a temporary painted line. No structural changes, just an experiment. The result: smoother recoveries, fewer wave-offs, and reduced risk of collision. The angled flight deck concept had just been born, but the breakthrough truly came the following year. In 1952, HMS Centaur was fitted with a real angled deck, a structural modification rather than just paint. The landing area was set at about 8.5 degrees off the center line, with an extended portside deck edge to catch missed landings. Cameras and mirrors helped pilots maintain the correct glide slope. Cambell himself demonstrated the concept in live trials, landing jet after jet in challenging sea states. The tests proved beyond doubt that a carrier could now recover aircraft, while simultaneously launching others from the bow catapults. For the first time in history, the deck could be both a runway and a launch pad. The Americans immediately took notice. The US Navy had been struggling with the same problem aboard its Essex-class carriers. When they saw the British results, they moved fast. USS Antietam became the first US carrier modified with an angled flight deck in 1952. The improvement was dramatic. Accident rates dropped. Launch and recovery cycles tightened. The air wing could maintain a near-constant presence over the sea. Still, an angled deck alone wasn't enough. It was part of a trio of interlocking innovations that together defined the modern carrier. The second was the optical landing system, a bright mirror display that projected a visual reference to pilots during approach. By following a glowing orange light within the mirror's frame, aviators could instantly see if they were high or low on the glide path. It replaced hand signals from deck officers, allowing for more precise and consistent landings. The third was the steam catapult. Earlier hydraulic or gunpowder systems could barely accelerate the heavier jets to flying speed. Steam catapults, developed by Commander Dennis Morley and engineer C.C. Mitchell, used high-pressure steam from the ship's boilers to hurl aircraft off the deck with brutal reliability. Now a fully loaded jet could launch in just 2 seconds. These three technologies, the angled deck, the mirror landing aid, and the steam catapult, arrived within the same few years. Together, they turned carriers from improvised airfields into efficient industrial-scale flight operations centers. The transformation was swift. By 1955, the US Navy had ordered angled deck conversions for nearly all its active carriers. The Royal Navy followed suit, as did France, Australia, and eventually even the Soviet Union. Within a decade, the straight deck was extinct. It was more than a technical upgrade. It was a strategic rebirth. With jets able to land and launch almost continuously, carriers regained their edge as mobile, self-contained air bases. The angled deck allowed strike groups to operate faster, longer, and farther from home ports. It restored the carrier's dominance in an age when missiles and nuclear bombers threatened to make them irrelevant. And for the men who flew those reverse landings, it changed everything about how they fought and how they survived. The human angle, fear, precision, and survival for generations of carrier pilots. Landing at sea was the most terrifying part of the job. In the age of straight decks, the sight of that narrow strip of steel was enough to make a man's pulse surge. The carrier itself moved unpredictably, rolling, pitching, sometimes rising 10 feet in a second. Even the most experienced aviators described each recovery as controlled disaster. A single mistake meant a deadly chain reaction. The landing signal officer could wave off a plane too late. A missed wire could mean plowing into the parked aircraft ahead. In seconds, the deck could erupt in fire and twisted metal. Many pilots died not in combat, but coming home. The angled deck broke that fear cycle. Suddenly, a missed wire didn't mean death. It meant go around. Bolters became survivable, even routine. Pilots reported a dramatic shift in mindset. Training accidents dropped, morale improved, and confidence soared. They could now focus on precision rather than survival. The first squadrons to operate from angled decks called it the difference between gambling and flying. Landing became a skill to master, not a coin toss to survive. And in war, a confident pilot was a lethal pilot. The tactical angle, doubling the strike, power before the angled deck, carrier warfare operated in rigid cycles. Launch all aircraft, recover all aircraft, clear the deck, repeat. The process was safe only when the deck was empty, meaning no takeoffs during recoveries and vice versa. Each deck cycle consumed critical minutes, sometimes hours, limiting how many aircraft could be launched per day. That bottleneck throttled strike operations. During Korea, the average sortie rate per carrier barely exceeded 70 a day, less than half the potential of the air wing. The angled deck rewrote the playbook. Now, while one jet was catching the wires aft, another could thunder off the catapult forward. Recovery and launch merged into one continuous rhythm. The once sequential process became parallel. In combat terms, that meant more aircraft over target, shorter turnaround times, and near constant pressure on the enemy. Fleet commanders could sustain high-intensity operations for days without pause. A carrier's air wing was no longer a blunt instrument. It became a rapid, adaptive strike system. When historians later said the angled deck doubled carrier strike power, it wasn't exaggeration, it was arithmetic. Twice the operational tempo, half the downtime, exponential flexibility. The ocean no longer dictated tempo. The deck did too. The technological angle, geometry of a revolution to the untrained eye, the angled deck was simply a diagonal line on a ship's surface. But beneath that line lay deep engineering genius. The typical angle settled between 8 and 10 degrees. Enough to give boltering aircraft safe clearance off the port side without overextending the ship's beam. The arresting wires were repositioned diagonally, and barriers were shifted forward to protect parked aircraft. The new geometry demanded recalibrated arresting gear hydraulics, stronger deck plating, and more powerful arrestor cables to handle jet weights. At the same time, the optical landing system, OLS, provided instant feedback on approach angle, something pilots had never had before. By keeping the meatball centered between datum lights, a pilot could maintain an ideal glide slope even in turbulent winds. Every component worked in harmony. The steam catapult launching with precision timing, the angled deck catching returning aircraft seconds later, and deck crews orchestrating both movements within yards of each other. For the first time, technology made the carrier safer and deadlier. It was a triumph of geometry, physics, and nerve, a design so elegant that 7 decades later, every major carrier on Earth still follows its pattern. The leadership angle, doctrine rewritten at sea, the Angled deck didn't just change how carriers looked, it changed how admirals thought. Before its invention, carrier operations were built around rigid deck cycles. Commanders planned strikes like trains on a timetable. Launch time, recovery time, refuel time, everything synchronized in long, vulnerable gaps. Once the angled deck arrived, those constraints collapsed. Fleet commanders could now plan rolling operations, launching small strike groups in continuous waves while others returned and rearmed. This allowed for near-constant coverage over the battle space. During Cold War patrols, an American carrier group could maintain air dominance across hundreds of miles, hour after hour, without exposing itself to the downtime that once left fleets defenseless. Leadership doctrine evolved quickly. Task Force 77 in the Pacific became the testing ground for cyclic ops, where aircraft recovery, rearm and relaunch happened like clockwork every 90 minutes. The angled deck made this precision possible. Naval aviators once said, "The deck crew fights the war as much as the pilots." Now, that statement became literal truth. Commanders coordinated deck handling like battlefield maneuvers. Every tow, refuel and launch calculated to the second. Carriers transformed from floating runways into synchronized aerial factories. The leaders who understood that shift, men like Admiral Arleigh Burke and Rear Admiral J.J. Jocko Clark, reshaped the very tempo of sea power. The future of naval air warfare would no longer be dictated by geography, but by geometry. The enemy angle, a new form of deterrence. The world's adversaries watched in silence as the first angled deck carriers deployed. Soviet naval attachés called it a moving airfield that never sleeps. To the Soviets, who relied on land-based bombers and coastal defense aircraft, the idea that a single ship could maintain round-the-clock strike capability hundreds of miles from shore was unnerving. Western intelligence reports from the mid-1950s show that Soviet planners suddenly began prioritizing carrier-killing weapons, long-range bombers, anti-ship missiles and nuclear torpedoes to counter this new threat. It wasn't just capability, it was perception. When U.S. carriers like Forrestal and Saratoga demonstrated angled deck operations, they projected an image of unstoppable momentum. Jets launched and recovered in an endless loop, engines screaming, decks lit like small cities at night. Enemies couldn't see the pauses, only the presence. For Cold War diplomacy, that mattered as much as combat. Carriers with angled decks became instruments of deterrence. They could appear anywhere, operate indefinitely, and vanish without warning. Nations that once dismissed them as relics of propeller warfare now saw them as the spearhead of American and British power. Every new carrier launch became a message. We can strike and recover whenever we choose. The safety and moral angle, the human cost, reduced warships have always balanced innovation with risk. The angled deck was that rare breakthrough that reduced danger instead of adding it. In the years before its introduction, U.S. Navy records showed carrier accidents accounted for nearly 40% of peacetime aviation fatalities. Deck fires, crashes and propeller strikes claimed lives even outside combat. Every sailor on deck understood how quickly a single mistake could become a disaster. After the angled deck's adoption, the change was immediate. Missed landings no longer destroyed aircraft or endangered deck crews. Barriers went from being last-ditch lifesavers to almost obsolete. Training programs shifted from survival drills to precision technique. Psychologically, the impact was enormous. Young pilots, once terrified of carrier qualification, began viewing it as a rite of mastery rather than luck. Flight surgeons noted lower stress levels and improved cognitive performance under pressure. Confidence replaced fear, but perhaps the greatest moral change came below decks. Maintenance crews, handlers and launch officers, all the unseen gears of a carrier, worked in an environment that finally rewarded discipline over desperation. The flight deck, once a killing field, became a stage for teamwork and timing. Safety had become strategy, and that, in turn, made every carrier strike group more resilient. more efficient and far more lethal. The angled deck was no mere innovation. It was an evolution of thought, technology, and courage. But history remembers it most for the moment everything changed, when theory met the open ocean, and one pilot proved that reverse landing was not just possible, it was the future. The dawn was grey over the English Channel on a cold February morning in 1952. Waves slammed against the hull of HMS Centaur, her deck slick with frost, her crew tense with expectation. On the island bridge stood Captain Dennis Cambell, the man whose unorthodox idea had brought them here. Below, a Sea Vampire jet waited at the aft of the carrier. Its pilot, Lieutenant Commander Eric Winkle Brown, one of the Royal Navy's most skilled test aviators, gave a final nod to the flight director. The ship's engines roared. The catapult fired. The jet climbed away cleanly, turned wide, and began its approach. But this wasn't the usual centerline recovery. Instead, Brown lined up along a painted stripe cutting diagonally across the deck, 8.5 degrees off the ship's axis. Every instinct in his body rebelled. Years of training told him this angle was wrong. But he trusted Cambell's design. Coming in from the port quarter felt like landing sideways, Brown later recalled. But it worked like a charm. The aircraft descended, the arresting hook caught the third wire, and in that moment, naval aviation changed forever. For the first time in history, a jet had safely landed on a carrier angled for recovery, while another aircraft waited on the bow for launch. The deck crews erupted in cheers. Cambell, usually composed, grinned openly as the implications sank in. That test wasn't merely a technical success. It was a proof of concept for a new era of sea power. Over the next several months, trials aboard Centaur and HMS Eagle confirmed the system's superiority. Bolter tests showed that missed landings no longer endangered deck operations. A pilot could simply throttle up, fly clear over the port side, and re-enter the pattern for another try. It was safer, faster, and astonishingly efficient. By mid-1952, the Royal Navy authorized permanent angled deck refits across its fleet. Within a year, the U.S. Navy followed. USS Antietam, CV-36, an Essex-class carrier, became the first American ship fitted with a 10.5-degree deck. Her first test came under rough weather in the Atlantic. The flight deck heaved with the swell, wind gusts buffeted the aircraft, and visibility dropped to near zero. Yet every approach ended the same way. Clean, safe recoveries. The results stunned observers. Bolter rates dropped by nearly half. Sortie generation increased by 30%. The ship's air wing could launch and recover in a single continuous sequence, something no straight-deck carrier had ever achieved. In that transformation lay the rebirth of carrier aviation. The timing couldn't have been more critical. The Korean War had revealed how badly the old system constrained American carriers. Deck crashes, wave-offs, and long recovery cycles limited their effectiveness in the jet-dominated skies over the peninsula. Now, as Cold War tensions mounted, the angled deck arrived as the perfect solution at the perfect time. Naval doctrine changed almost overnight. The U.S. Navy began converting its Essex-class carriers, while new builds, like the Forrestal class, were designed from the keel up around the angled deck. Steam catapult, an optical landing system, aboard Forrestal in 1955, the concept reached full maturity. Her massive deck, over 1,000 feet long, could support near-simultaneous launch and recovery of the new F-9F Panthers, FJ-3 Furies, and early Skyhawks. It was as if two separate airfields operated on the same ship. For pilots, it felt like liberation. The old terror of landing on a pitching, narrow runway gave way to a system that rewarded skill and confidence. The angled deck, one aviator wrote, gave us room to breathe and room to fight. For the first time, carrier aviation matched the pace of jet warfare. In a single decade, the angled deck had turned chaos into choreography. What began as an experiment, painted in white lines on a British deck, became the defining geometry of the world's most powerful weapons platform. Yet the true test was still to come, not in trials or peacetime exercises, but in real deployments where deck operations decided life or death. Because by the late 1950s, the Cold War was heating up, and carriers with angled decks were about to prove their worth in a new kind of confrontation. By the late 1950s, the angled deck had already proven its engineering value, but now it would prove its combat worth. Across the globe, the Cold War had divided the seas into invisible front lines. Every carrier deployment became a political signal as much as a military one. When a U.S. Navy task force appeared off a contested coast, its air wing stood as both sword and shield. In 1956, the Suez Crisis offered the first real-world test. British and French carriers, Eagle, Bulwark and Arromanches, operated jets with angled decks for the first time in a live combat zone. Over the Mediterranean, Seahawks and Sea Venoms launched and recovered around the clock, supporting paratroopers and ground strikes. Observers noticed something remarkable. There were no major deck accidents during weeks of continuous sorties. The angled deck had allowed smooth, rolling operations, aircraft launching from the bow while others landed aft, even under combat pressure. The same year, USS Forrestal demonstrated the full doctrine of cyclic operations in the Atlantic. Her deck crews executed launch and recovery cycles every 90 minutes for days on end. The carrier maintained over 100 sorties a day, nearly double what straight-deck predecessors could manage in Korea. It was proof that the carrier's power now scaled with geometry. Naval strategists called it the forrestal formula. The combination of angled deck, steam catapult, and mirror landing system turned the carrier into an industrial machine of air warfare. Each jet recovered, refueled, rearmed, and relaunched in a seamless rhythm that mirrored factory production lines. Even the sound changed. The crash of barriers and the clang of emergency hooks were replaced by the steady cadence of safe, confident recoveries. The flight deck, once chaos, had become choreography. During these years, the Soviet Union was watching closely. Soviet naval intelligence filmed every NATO carrier exercise it could. Analysts concluded that the new deck design allowed Western navies to sustain operations for far longer than expected. In Soviet briefings, this was called the perpetual strike problem. To counter it, Moscow poured resources into developing long-range bombers like the Tu-16 Badger and Tu-22 Blinder, armed with anti-ship missiles. Yet even these weapons couldn't erase the psychological effect of seeing a single American or British carrier group capable of generating constant sorties over the horizon. The message was unmistakable. The angled deck made sea power infinite in endurance. Meanwhile, on the decks themselves, a quiet revolution was happening among the men and women who worked there. Flight deck crews, often overlooked in war films, became the heartbeat of the carrier. Dressed in color-coded shirts, each team performed a precise role. Catapult operators in green, ordnance crews in red, handlers in blue, directors in yellow. With the angled layout, their choreography changed. No longer did recovering aircraft slice through their workspace. The port side became a safe bolter lane, while the starboard remained the launch zone. This separation of danger zones dramatically reduced fatalities. The deck environment, once synonymous with risk, became a masterpiece of human organization under pressure. By the early 1960s, the new system faced its next proving ground. The long-endurance deployments of the Vietnam era, when carriers like USS Oriskany and Bonhomme Richard entered the Gulf of Tonkin, their angled decks carried the weight of relentless combat. Day after day, Skyhawks, Crusaders, and Phantoms thundered off the bow, struck North Vietnamese targets, and returned in tight formations, even under heavy combat tempo. Recovery rates remained steady, mishaps rare. Pilots landing with battle damage could miss all the wires and still fly out safely for another attempt. Lives that would have been lost on straight decks were now routinely saved. The angled deck's ultimate triumph wasn't just measured in sorties, it was measured in survival. Each recovery in combat reaffirmed the design's brilliance. The diagonal path wasn't a gimmick. it was salvation. It allowed the carrier to function continuously in the harshest, most unpredictable environment on Earth, war at sea. By the end of that decade, every major naval power, from Britain to France, from the United States to the Soviet Union, had adopted the concept in some form. Even smaller navies, operating light carriers and helicopter decks, borrowed the geometry. The slanted runway became a symbol. It represented discipline, innovation, and adaptability, the three pillars that had always defined successful navies. It turned a floating hazard into a controlled system of motion and power. In that transformation, the carrier ceased to be a vulnerable ship and became a city of perpetual flight. The angled deck had done what no admiral or politician could. It united human courage, machine precision, and mathematical elegance into one seamless act. And from that act, the modern carrier era was born. The story, however, doesn't end on the roaring deck of the 1960s, because what followed next would show how this geometric revolution reshaped not just tactics, but global strategy itself. By the mid-1960s, the angled flight deck was no longer an experiment. It was the universal language of sea power. Every major navy had either adopted it or was in the process of doing so. The numbers alone told the story. In the decade before its introduction, U.S. carriers averaged nearly 30 serious deck accidents per year, a grim statistic that cost millions in aircraft and dozens of lives. Within 5 years of the angled deck's arrival, that number fell by more than half. Bolter incidents, once the deadliest hazard at sea, dropped by nearly 70%. The human cost of training the next generation of pilots had finally begun to shrink. Operational efficiency improved just as dramatically. Before 1952, even the best straight-deck carriers managed roughly 70-80 sorties a day. By the early 1960s, angled-deck ships such as Forrestal, Enterprise, and Saratoga routinely sustained over 130-150 sorties daily, with some surge operations exceeding 200. The ability to recover and launch simultaneously compressed deck cycles to under 90 minutes. That new rhythm changed fleet behavior. Carrier task forces no longer needed to sail in tight, mutually protected formations. With jets cycling constantly, a single carrier could project air cover for an entire strike group, freeing destroyers and cruisers for independent missions. Logistics trains shortened, escorts dispersed, and the reach of naval air power expanded far beyond pre-war imagination. At the same time, ship design itself evolved. The old Essex and Illustrious classes, converted to angled decks, became floating laboratories for next-generation ideas. Deck-edge elevators replaced mid-deck lifts to clear the recovery zone. Catapult tracks extended diagonally, reducing the risk of jet blast across the landing path. New deck coatings absorbed heat and friction from heavier aircraft, and below decks, everything changed with them. Hangars grew larger, ordnance lifts faster, fuel lines safer. Carrier design had shifted from improvisation to integration, a single ecosystem built around the rhythm of launch and recovery. The numbers impressed the politicians as much as the admirals. In Washington and London, reports praised the efficiency dividend of the new decks. More firepower per ton, more presence per ship. By the late 1950s, navies could justify fewer carriers doing more work. In the Cold War's balance of budgets that mattered as much as combat potential, it also transformed naval aviation culture. The angled deck created a generation of pilots who trusted the system and in turn pushed it harder. Training hours increased. Night operations expanded. Instrument recoveries, once considered nearly suicidal, became routine. The confidence bred innovation, low visibility landings, all-weather approaches, and eventually automated flight control systems. By the end of the 1960s, it was clear that the angled deck had not merely solved a problem. It had rewritten the DNA of naval air warfare. The straight-deck carrier, once the pride of the Pacific War, faded into history, remembered with nostalgia, but also with relief. Because for every navy that adopted the angled deck, The message was the same. The sea was no longer the limit. The angled deck didn't just revolutionize flight operations, it reshaped global strategy. By the 1970s, the United States Navy had turned the concept into a doctrine of projection, the ability to strike anywhere, at any time, from a moving runway in the middle of the ocean. With angled deck carriers at its core, this doctrine became the foundation of modern American power. During the long and grinding years of the Vietnam War, that power was tested daily. Carriers such as Kitty Hawk, Oriskany, and Constellation conducted tens of thousands of sorties day and night under intense operational tempo. Crews sometimes worked 20 hours at a stretch, launching and recovering in endless cycles. Yet the system held. Pilots trusted the deck trusted its crews, and the fleet trusted the design. The angled landing area and optical guidance system allowed approaches through monsoon squalls and crosswinds that would have been impossible a decade earlier. Each safe landing under fire validated the engineers and test pilots, who had once been ridiculed for painting a diagonal stripe on a ship, even in crises far from Vietnam, such as the 1967 Liberty Incident, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, or the tense standoffs of the late Cold War. Carriers with angled decks proved their worth as tools of diplomacy and deterrence. A fleet that could recover jets while launching others could stay on station indefinitely. Presence became permanence. The strategic shift strategists in both Washington and Moscow quickly understood the deeper significance. The angled deck had doubled not only sortie rates, but credibility. For the first time in history, naval air power could maintain uninterrupted cycles of combat readiness without returning to port, without pause, without weakness. That permanence changed everything about deterrence. The carrier was no longer a mobile airfield. It was a floating nation-state with its own rules of engagement. Soviet intelligence referred to it as the diagonal advantage. In response, they built larger and more heavily armed anti-ship platforms, such as the Kiev class and Admiral Kuznetsov. Even then, they adopted the angled deck layout, conceding the geometry even as they contested the doctrine. Smaller powers followed suit. France's Clemenceau, Australia's Melbourne, and India's Vikrant all adopted the angled landing configuration. Even light carriers and helicopter assault ships incorporated miniature angled zones for safety and efficiency. No one could ignore its logic. The diagonal had become destiny, technological legacy. The lineage continued through every generation of naval aviation. When the nuclear-powered Enterprise launched in 1961, its massive 100-foot deck embodied every lesson of Cambell's sketch from a decade earlier. The same principles guided the later Nimitz class and today's Gerald R. Ford class, each featuring optimized angles, advanced arresting gear, and precision optical systems. Even the evolution of aircraft mirrored this geometry. From the heavy F-4 Phantom to the agile FA-18 Hornet, every design incorporated the requirement for angled recoveries. Modern pilots still align themselves along that same diagonal line, first painted on HMS Triumph in 1951. Today's optical landing systems have evolved into laser-guided precision arrays, and computer-assisted approach cues now glow on digital screens. Yet their heart, the human act of landing slightly sideways on a moving deck, remains unchanged. Enduring human impact for sailors and aviators, the angled deck symbolized more than progress. It symbolized trust. Trust that design could save lives. Trust that courage and calculation could coexist. Trust that the ocean could be mastered, not merely survived. By the close of the Cold War, thousands of pilots owed their lives to that single diagonal innovation. Every successful bolter, every clean trap, every safe return from combat traced back to Cambell's vision and Brown's first landing. The old fear of the straight deck had faded into legend, remembered only in museums and training films. In its place stood confidence, a quiet kind of power that defined a generation of naval aviators. The angled deck didn't just make carriers faster or safer, it made them eternal, and in the calm hum of jet engines recovering at dusk, as the sea glows beneath the deck lights, the truth of that legacy still echoes across every fleet in motion. The ocean has never forgiven mistakes. For centuries, sailors learned that lesson with every storm, every fire, every steel hull that vanished beneath the waves. But in the age of flight, the sea's cruelty became even more personal, because it could reach the sky. Landing a jet on a moving ship in rough water was once humanity's most dangerous routine. It demanded courage beyond calculation. Yet one subtle change in geometry, the slant of a painted line, made that courage sustainable. The angled deck did not emerge from triumph or arrogance, but from fear, from the knowledge that the straight path could no longer serve in a curved world. It came from men like Dennis Cambell and Eric Brown, who saw that innovation sometimes means defying instinct and tradition. That angled runway was more than a technical feature. It was a philosophy. It turned chaos into choreography. It allowed technology to serve humanity rather than punish it. It taught the modern Navy that precision and compassion could coexist on the same strip of steel. Decades later, the diagonal across every carrier deck still defines the rhythm of power at sea. Each trap and each launch, each roar of jet engines against wind and salt spray, is a living echo of that first sideways landing in 1952. The world's oceans are still vast, unpredictable, and merciless. But now, when a pilot lines up on final approach and sees the angled lights shimmering across the dark sea, he isn't gambling with fate. He's part of a design, a perfect alignment of courage, calculation, and human progress. A straight deck built an empire, an angled one built an era, and in that simple diagonal stroke across steel, mankind learned how to bend the laws of danger and draw its own line of survival upon the sea.